Hello, my name is Samara Hayley Steele, and I'm a PhD candidate in cultural studies at UC Davis in the Science and Technology Studies designated emphasis. I'm also a project director at ModLab, the Digital Humanities Laboratory at UC Davis. And I have the honor of working with a team from Lewis and Clark College, Western Washington University, as well as another UC Davis researcher to bring you this presentation, which is entitled, Should Future Scenarios Factor in the Impact of Racism Upon Emissions? In our review of research, we found that racism is a driver of emissions from on-road travel in the U.S., and we concluded that it's time to study racism as a driver of emissions in a more general way. In this talk, I'm going to discuss present research supporting a limited understanding of the non-linear relationship between emissions and racism, racism's effect on innovation and decision-making, racism's effects on energy policy and climate science, and the need for additional research to support the inclusion of racism in scenarios. Lately, research has received attention showing that communities and countries with majority people of color populations emit less CO2 and cause less air pollution. Some quick examples. A 2019 study coupled economic input-output relationships to pollution emission sources in the U.S., exploring how consumption activities of three groups, labeled Black, Hispanic, and White/Other, led to fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5 exposure. The study found that Black people's consumption activities result in 23% less exposure to fine particulate matter than average, and that Hispanic people cause 31% less exposure than average. Meanwhile, those in the White/Other category cause 12% more exposure than average. Similarly, in another study, an economist worked to calculate excess CO2 emissions by country. The researcher calculated national fair shares of a safe global carbon budget consistent with the 350 parts per million atmospheric CO2 planetary boundary, which was surpassed in 1990. This study looked at data from 1850 to 2015 and also used per capita calculations to allow a country's population size to be factored in when determining its fair share of emissions. The researchers found that global north countries were responsible for 92% of global emissions exceeding the planetary boundary, while global south countries, which are more likely to have a majority people of color population, were responsible for just 8% of all excess emissions. These two studies and many others show disproportionate rates of CO2 emissions and pollution being generated by communities and countries of color. Prior scenarios have explained discrepancies like these using de-racialized measurements, such as affluence and land use. However, there is data to support a more causal relationship between racism and emissions. We were able to find a 2018 study that used a hybrid panel model to test the effects of racial composition upon CO2 emissions in the United States across 3,079 counties from on-road travel between 2001 and 2006. Their findings include, firstly, that when the Black population of a county increases, that county's emissions also increase. Offering a theoretical explanation, the researchers posited that racist housing practices in the United States, such as redlining and gentrification, along with racist transportation policies that divert funding away from public transportation in majority Black areas, led Black people to live in places further away from their jobs, forcing longer commutes by car or the use of less efficient forms of public transport, like diesel-fueled buses. Conversely, when Black counties see an increase in affluence, their CO2 emissions from on-road travel decreases. They controlled for many relevant factors. There were limits to this study, including that it looked at one category of emissions from on-road travel, but the study did show a non-linear relationship between populations that experience racist housing and transportation practices and CO2 emissions, which is to say, this limited study did find a relationship between structural racism and climate. Likewise, turning to another study, a 2020 Yale survey found that people of color in the U.S. were more likely to be concerned about climate change than white respondents. It also found that people of color were more likely to prioritize climate change in their voting decisions. Specifically, while 49% of white respondents were alarmed or concerned about climate change, that number jumped to 57% for Black respondents and 69% for Latino/Hispanic respondents. White respondents were more likely to be doubtful or dismissive about climate change at a rate of 27%, whereas among Hispanic/Latino respondents and Black respondents, only 11 to 13% expressed doubt or dismissiveness regarding climate change. Hispanic/Latino voters and Black voters were also more likely to rank climate change as an important factor in an upcoming voting decision than white voters. Looking at these numbers, at least within the context of the United States where the survey was taken, we can infer that when systemic racism forces Black and Hispanic or Latino people from decision-making spaces, the likelihood that the people in the room take climate change seriously decreases. Also, when Black and Hispanic or Latino people are denied access to voting in the U.S., the likelihood of electing policymakers who take climate change seriously decreases. Looking out more broadly at the effect of racism upon innovation and decision-making, there are a number of studies that indicate ethnic diversity in groups improves decision-making, fosters greater innovation, and leads to enhanced information processing for everyone in the group, including those who are in the ethnic majority, and that these benefits can be stimulated by anti-racist practices and policies that promote systemic equity and inclusion. While there is not time in this presentation to discuss all of these studies, I want to highlight this 2020 study analyzing data from 3 decades of PhD recipients in the U.S. They found that PhD students who are ethnic minorities innovate at higher rates, but their novel contributions are more likely to be dismissed and they are less likely to earn academic positions. This is just one example of the research that shows how racism reduces innovation and removes innovators in every field, thus reducing society's overall capacity to address climate change. As for climate science and energy policy, in 2019, the University of Minnesota released a policy report entitled "Diversifying Leadership is Necessary for Climate and Energy." This report argues that structural racism fuels emissions in a variety of ways, including the concentration of social power and by limiting the potential for innovation. Likewise, in 2020, marine biologist and climate policy writer Ayana Elizabeth Johnson wrote a Washington Post editorial exploring the ways racism and anti-Blackness have disrupted her own work and forestalled climate action. Quoting Toni Morrison, she writes, "The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work." In her editorial, as well as in an NPR interview, she explores how racism disrupts the ability of the very people who are statistically most likely to care about climate change from addressing it. Racism contributes to emissions along a variety of fronts, from structural racism, creating longer commute times, to preventing climate policy from getting written. What would it look like if our scenarios tracked the impact that racism will have on emissions in coming decades? Past studies have tended to focus on diversity rather than racism, or have been quite limited in scope. What if we were to use a similar approach to the way the impact of sexism on emissions has been studied? This study looked at a variety of indicators, such as women's freedom of movement and ability to participate in civil society and hold leadership roles. What if we were to run a similar study to see if we can track a predictable relationship between emissions and racism using a variety of indicators across social domains? The tools exist to create a study like this. Some useful datasets include the Ethnic Power Relations Dataset Family and the VDEM Codebook. In summary, present research supports a limited understanding that there is a non-linear relationship between emissions and racism. Racism has been found to have an effect on innovation and decision-making. Experts have stated the need to address the effects of racism on energy policy and climate science. Our recommendation is to use heterogeneous panel analysis to study the relationship between racism and CO2 emissions, and to use better parameterization of studies than many studies in the past, to use racism metrics rather than diversity metrics, and further study in general towards including the effects of racism in scenarios. I hope this talk encourages conversation about the steps that would need to be taken to better explore the relationship between racism and emissions. Here is my contact information. Please reach out to me for any and all questions. It is an honor to be part of the 2022 Scenarios Forum.